So today is going to be an informal session. It's the last session, and the title of the talk was Reflections of a Scholar. So I have a lot of leeway to be informal. But what I would like to do is sort of speak to the main issues as I see them, for whatever it's worth. On issues of contemporary anti-Semitism and the challenges that we face as scholars and also people living on campus, if you will, participating on campus. I would say that in spite of the work of ISGAP, and we're sort of all over the map, we opened a center in Rome, they started the seminar series in Rome, and I think the atmosphere in Italy is very different than North America, very different than the Anglo and French world. It's amazing how clear scholars and the Vatican, and I'm a skeptical person by nature, but even the Vatican has been extraordinarily forthcoming in willing to work with us and in understanding that anti-Semitism is not only a Jewish issue, but something that's very important to the civilized world and to Christians in the world and the church, and how this hatred is a threat to stability. So it's amazing how in Italy we had our inaugural event and we had 35 full professors, hundreds of students, 6 representatives from the Vatican, and they take us seriously. And I think that, unfortunately, I think their perception is correct. And I remember speaking to friends and colleagues about the Iranian revolutionary regime and how radical political Islam, and I'm not speaking about Islam and I'm not speaking about Muslims, I'm speaking about a reactionary social movement that is diametrically opposed to democratic principles, to notions of citizenship, to equality of everybody under one legal system, how this movement is using anti-Semitism in a very skillful way and a very effective way. So by looking at the Jew, by looking at the Zionist, by looking at the Israeli, this social movement is gaining more and more power in more and more societies and over more and more institutions, as we in the West seem either uninterested or incapable of speaking out very clearly to what is anti-Semitism and what is the threat to the Jewish people, but also beyond the Jewish people, and how this is a threat to our principles. And it's staggering. I think it's most acute in my experience in the United States, that even among the leadership of the Jewish community, there's the whole question of whether anti-Semitism is a problem of anti-Zionism or a problem of policies against Israel. So if Netanyahu would change his policies and the settlement policies wouldn't be as difficult for some to accept or to stomach, that maybe anti-Semitism would diminish, maybe the grievances of Palestinians and the grievances of other people in the neighborhood in the Middle East would sort of dissipate to a significant extent. And there's a debate, you know, the Beinhardt, the J Street movement, and there's really a situation in the Jewish community where students and intellectuals seem to be, in my mind, handcuffed. You know, what is anti-Semitism? When does this phenomenon become anti-Semitism? When is criticism of Israel really anti-Semitic? And we're sort of navel-gazing as this reactionary social movement is gaining more and more control. And I remember speaking to colleagues about the dangers of Iran and the Iranian revolutionary regime and their grip in Syria and their grip in Lebanon, and how Muslims, and if people care about human rights, how Muslims are the greatest victim of this reactionary social movement, how they use anti-Semitism, they try to focus people's attention, not dissimilarly to what the Nazis did, to focus on the Jew, to focus on the Israeli. It's like the puppeteer. Look here, while we take away the rights of gay people, we eliminate them. We subjugate women, and we do away with the rights of religious minorities. We do away with notions of citizenship and equality under the law. So I would speak to my friends how this use of anti-Semitism is not just a Jewish issue, but something that's much more ought to be of general concern. Now we can look at Syria, and we can see a regime, Iran, which has not been challenged in its anti-Semitism by the West and by many intellectuals, and certainly by the human rights community. We see Iran helping the Assad regime, supported by Hezbollah. You know, what is the death toll today? You know, it's 140,000, 160,000. How many refugees from Syria? You know, and what is the West doing in the face of this? And it's not disconnected from anti-Semitism. When Ayatollah Khomeini, the day before the Obama administration and the other 5 countries, the 5 countries plus 1, signed the interim agreement with Iran over the nuclear weapons accord, you know, Ayatollah Khomeini called the Jews, not just the Israelis and the Zionists, but Jews, rabid dogs that were the cause of all of the world's harm. He went on a disgusting sort of, you know, rhetorical rampage. And nobody really said anything. That could you imagine if the same was said about another group? Would Obama's administration sign an interim agreement with the regime? And the silence of the human rights community. And I find it staggering. Can you imagine if an African leader would come to the United States or come to a Western country and say that all Africans, all black Africans, were the descendants of apes and pigs, and they were the cause of all the evil and disease in the world? I think in 2014, as somebody who's active in the anti-apartheid movement, I think, you know, thankfully, in 2014, that type of ideology would not be tolerated. And that person or that regime would be told to leave. And yet, when it comes to anti-Semitism, there's a silence. Several days ago, a young American Jewish journalist working for the Jerusalem Post was not given a visa to go to Saudi Arabia with the administration, Obama's administration, to the Middle East, and he didn't make the trip. Right? But can you imagine if an African American or a woman was refused to have a visa to accompany the entourage of the President of the United States, an American citizen, not permitted to enter into an allied country? It's staggering, in my opinion. So we have a regime. So I think with radical political Islam, we have an ideology that's sort of upfront, honest, open, and consistent. So they don't hide the fact that they're anti-Semitic. You can count on them. And I think, so we've been meeting here now for a while. Has anybody read the founding fathers of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Qutb and Sayyid, Qutb, Ayatollah Khomeini? Has anybody read this material? You read the material, the Hamas Charter? Okay. So I think it's really incumbent upon students and scholars, but not only the scholars, but people who care about issues of human rights, to go back to the founding fathers of this social movement, of this reactionary social movement, and begin to understand that this is not just because of the Jews or the Israeli policy, that this is something that has been emanating from the Middle East for the past century. The scholars and the students, that we have to go back to the foundation of the social movement, and that this movement is rooted in thought. So when Ahmadinejad or Ayatollah Khomeini say these disgusting things that that Jews are the descendants of dogs or apes or pigs, whatever it is, that we often perceive in the media that this is sort of the rantings of lunatics, of crazy people, of unbalanced people. But what we need to do as scholars and as students and people who are concerned about human rights and the dignity of all people is to go back to the foundational messages, ideology of this movement, and look at the discourse, and understand that the rantings of these people they're not crazy people. They may be immoral and unethical, but it's rooted in philosophy, it's rooted in a political social movement, it's rooted in a worldview. They have a very clear, well-articulated, well-thought-out agenda, and they're pushing ahead in it. And it's we in the West, scholars, intellectuals, policymakers, by not engaging this ideology in any serious way, we've been the ones that have been, I'd say, neglectful. So when Ahmadinejad went to Columbia University, where we have our seminar series, and he got up and he said that there were no gay people in Iran. Do you remember this? And the finest professors from the best university in the country in Middle Eastern affairs, and the best graduate students, and the best undergraduate students in the country, they laughed at him, if you remember. If you remember when he said this, the entire audience burst into laughter. Because he was dismissed as a strange, extreme, stupid guy. But if these fine scholars and these fine intellectuals would actually take 10 minutes to begin to study the ideology of Ahmadinejad and the regime, they would have been able to see very clearly that what he articulated was absolutely correct. That there are no gay people in Iran, because if there were to be anybody would be found out to be gay, they could be publicly executed, hung on a crane. They could be forcibly put into sex change, gender-changing operations, which the regime is doing. So they don't tolerate gay people in Iran. So what he said was actually true, right? But we have to kind of peel away the layers of this society and begin to understand it. And this is the case, I think, when it comes to anti-Semitism, the regime's perception, or radical Islam's perception of minorities, of gay people, the role of women, and the place of Jews. And the place of Jews is also very clear in the sense that the Jewish people through the State of Israel are the only others to have self-determination on Islamic land. There's no other that has self-determination on Islamic land in the region. So it's not a question of where Netanyahu or the successor, the next administration in Israel decides to draw the lines, decides to make, there'll be a peace process, and they're going to give land, or they'll give a Palestinian state on certain land or in certain areas. It's not a question for the Islamists of where these boundaries are going to be demarcated, because even if Israel would cede all of its land except for Tel Aviv, and say we're going to have a Jewish city-state, and have self-determination over Tel Aviv, that this would be inappropriate for an Islamist, because no non-believing Muslim has the right to have self-determination over land, number one, or to be equal under one legal system with a Muslim. Because if you know the Sharia law and the Islamist political movement, they have notions of dhimitude, second-class citizens, and the like. And democratic notions of equality under the law is not in keeping with the Islamist notion of imposing Sharia law in society and replacing democracy, which is a vestige of, in their view, of Western colonialism and imperialism that needs to be removed. And if you look at the Hamas charter, if it wasn't so serious, it would almost be like a Monty Python skit. But here you have the social movement that wants to rid the Palestinian society of the Islamic world of all foreign influence, of Christians and Crusaders and Jews and communists and capitalists. And they take the most pernicious form of European anti-Semitism and fuse it in the covenant. That the theme running through the covenant, the charter, this is not the military wing or the extreme wing, this is the founding document of Hamas, is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is the document that helped pave the way to remove Jews from the mainstream of European society, to demonize them, and pave the way for the Holocaust. And we, as we know from our history, from the history of hatred, that words and ideas are the beginning of the problem. The concentration camps didn't emerge from nowhere, they emerged from ideas. They emerged from policies that come from ideas, that come from words. And today, Islamists and others are using the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the most dangerous forms of anti-Semitism, as mainstream, and I'm repeating myself, as mainstream political culture that is entering into society and portraying Jews and Israelis and Zionists in the most disgusting way. So on the one hand, part of my reflections is what's going on in the Middle East and the Islamic world, the takeover of this reactionary force. And don't be fooled, in the Islamic world there's all sorts of traditions of liberal Islam and moderate Islam and democratic movements, so it's not a monolithic entity, but this reactionary movement is gaining control. And then when you come to the academy, to the West, I would say we're stuck in a malaise where we're being learned, in the words of Ivan Illich, we're being taught not to think. And it's absurd. Recently I had an experience with Judith Butler. There's a group of people, she was supposed to speak at the Jewish Museum in New York, and some colleagues were trying to get the event canceled, and literally they bought all the seats for the event within 30 minutes, and they called up the Jewish Museum, and they told them if they don't cancel the event, there's going to be hundreds of anti-Judith Butler people in the audience. They canceled the event. But Judith Butler was going to use, and unlike Norman Finkelstein, I think Judith Butler is a genius. I think she's actually quite evil, and I'm choosing my words carefully, but she's a genius. She's a serious scholar, she's a serious philosopher, and she knows her material well. And she used an analysis of Franz Kafka to demonize Israel, and to demonize the notion of Jewish self-determination as a genius. And she wrote a paper, and it's in the London Review of Books, and there's an audio tape of her presentation at the British Museum. I urge you to read it, or to listen to it. It's brilliant. But she uses her analysis of Franz Kafka to attack contemporary Zionism and Jews who support the Zionist entity as basically being fascist, apartheid-supporting racists. But done in a brilliant way. So here you have a Jewish, gay, lesbian, American woman who literally goes around the world saying that Hezbollah and Hamas should be perceived as part of the progressive left. She's given honorary doctorate degrees. She was given one at McGill University, and even staggeringly, the Jewish community in Hillel here refused, from what I understand, to take a very strong position against this. I don't know if it's because they're intellectually lazy, or they don't want to get involved in conflicts, but it passed, and it passed relatively quietly. She was given the Adorno Prize in Berlin. She's being feted throughout the world. She speaks in Germany. She gets 15,000 people attending an event. 15,000 people. It's staggering. And why? Because she's a Jewish woman, and and the fact that she's Jewish, I think, plays a big role in it. And she's criticizing Israel. And in the words of Benny Morris, who spoke at our center last week, he's basically saying that this sort of inability to speak out against genocidal anti-Semitism, and I'm choosing my words deliberately, genocidal anti-Semitism, and make no mistake about it, this is a social movement that is out to rid the Middle East of Jews, certainly their ability to self-determination, if not the Jewish people themselves, depending on which flavor we're focusing on. And so while this reactionary social movement, which is genocidal and clearly is in its own rhetoric and philosophy and theology and policy, we in the West can't take a strong, coherent position against this social movement because somehow it's become politically incorrect. And why has it become politically incorrect? So in the books that I distributed last time, our center published a 6-volume book series called Global Anti-Semitism, A Crisis of Modernity. And there's a section in my introduction where I focus on postmodernism. And one of the things we can see in postmodernity is that this belief coming out of the Second World War, and certainly Europe suffered from the excesses of colonialism and racism and extreme nationalism. There was a philosophical movement to try and get away from what had happened, so sort of from binary notions of ideology and of thinking. And we came into a notion where postmodernity rose in importance. And in postmodernity, we try to put emphasis on the fact that we are not, white or black, and we're not British or French, and we have hybrid identities, and there's shades of gray, and even, I may be a Jewish man, but in certain situations I have different identities. I could be a allophone in Quebec, and I could be an English speaker in France, and I could be a scholar here, and I could be a son there, and I could be a friend here. We all have different identities and sort of notions of hybridity. So there's nothing good and evil kind of gets reduced and that sort of thing in the philosophy. And we have people like Edward Said, who has now emerged, I think, as an important part of this sort of postmodern canon, of the post-colonial, postmodern canon. And Edward Said, in his writings, never, as far as I'm aware, focuses on certainly anti-Semitism. He's out to kind of deconstruct the Zionist project as a part of the colonial modernist, as a modernist colonial imperial entity, and it's deconstructed. But what we fail to do is that what we fail to do as scholars is to have a critique of the critique. So in my writings, in the introduction, for example, I show how Michel Foucault, who's an important contributor to the sort of postmodern moment, perceived the Iranian Revolution as something that was essential in critiquing the excesses of materialism and of capitalism, and that he perceived the Iranian Revolution as something that was what Kant was to the French Revolution, Khomeini was going to be to the Persian Revolution, to the Iranian Revolution, to the Islamic world. And Edward Said, who was in Paris in the late 70s and 80s, was also supporting Foucault's perception of the Iranian Revolution as something positive. So there is this blind spot, philosophically, historically, and politically, where we cannot critique the critique. So to critique those who were once colonized, to critique Africans and Asians and indigenous people of the Americas in this sort of postmodern anti-racist worldview is heresy. So, and I remember coming back, I was part of the anti-apartheid movement as a kid here in Canada, as the chairperson of the African National Congress Solidarity Committee of Canada, and very active in Europe in the anti-apartheid movement, and a critical, progressive scholar, educated in London and Oxford, the most progressive social theory going. And I remember coming back from Israel, where I was living in Jerusalem, participating in Israeli and Palestinian, a group of scholars were trying to make rapprochement, and in Ramallah became friendly with a guy from Islamic Jihad who was a part of this group, and argued with him on the first two occasions, but then started to read his literature and ask him questions to understand rather than to confront and to argue. And I came back to London and I met my my anti-colonial, anti-apartheid comrades, and started telling them that I don't think the peace process is going to work because the Islamists are rising in power, and their ideology is really problematic. It's sexist, it's homophobic, it's anti-Semitic. So my comrades right away said, "Oh, you've become a Zionist. You're now an apartheid supporting racist." Right? So and these are serious. So of that group, I have one friend that I still argue with, but he speaks to me. The rest don't speak to me. And this is what we face as scholars, as who care about this at a philosophical level, and as students and individuals living in a world where anti-Semitism is rising, and we are intellectually handcuffed to speak out clearly. So we have to, at one level, these are my reflections, break through things philosophically, I think, and if we begin to address the philosophical constraints, that maybe we could begin to have an inroad politically. And we speak here, the issues in France, and I think France is probably 10 years ahead of us in North America. Those who know the European context, I think anti-Semitism and the influx of, I know it's politically incorrect, but I can actually substantiate this academically, that the influx of Muslims from certain countries has increased anti-Semitism. And I say this based on research in which we interviewed 5,000 Europeans, and we showed the correlation between the rise of anti-Semitism and what we call Israel bashing. And there is a disproportionate amount in the Muslim community based on this survey that points to high levels of anti-Semitism compared to other Europeans. So there is an issue. And there's an issue where it's difficult for people to speak out. And I think this Dujane issue a few months ago maybe began to push certain liberal intellectuals and commentators to really take a look at the correlation between contemporary anti-Semitism's use of Israel bashing and classical forms of anti-Semitism. And I think there's an awareness that the two are not completely separate, and that intellectuals and scholars and human rights activists have to take these connections into account. So, in a sense, we're dealing with something that is politically incorrect. I was watching the BDS hearings at the University of Michigan. I don't know if anybody monitors this sort of the BDS movement in North America. And, you know, for somebody who was active in politics, anti-apartheid, Soviet Jewry, Ethiopian Jewry, anti-racism, I'm on all these campuses on a regular basis, and I was watching the hearings from the University of Michigan, and I was shocked. I was shocked at the hatred coming from a lot of students. Really, really shocked. I was deeply disturbed and shocked that on campuses what is passing as progressive politics is so unbelievably, unashamedly, directly anti-Semitic. It boggled my mind that this was going on. This was officially sanctioned speech in a debate whether to divest, for the student body to divest from companies doing business in Israel. But the discussion was disturbing. The motion was defeated at the University of Michigan, which is the good news, but this is becoming part of our local political situation, which I think if people care about issues of anti-Semitism, the rights of Jews in Canada, in the United States, in Western countries, that this is something that we're going to have to really get our heads around and really develop a strategy to cope with it, because it's coming. It's coming on campus big time. And I'll be finished in a few minutes and we can have a whole informal discussion. And it's going to come onto campus, and this is demonizing Canadian and Quebec and American Jewish kids. That this is no longer in Israel, this is no longer an abstract discussion of what is anti-Semitism and what is Israel bashing and what is anti-Zionism and what is legitimate criticism of Israel. This stuff is coming. It may be at McGill in 6 months, it may be here in 3 years, but it's coming. And it's an organized, extraordinarily well organized movement in North America. You can see at the University of Michigan, you had outside speakers like Blumenthal, which Michel recently wrote about, you know, who used to work for a Hezbollah-based paper in Lebanon, and he's part of the progressive human rights movement fighting for BDS on campus. So you have Jewish intellectuals, like very sophisticated people like Judith Butler, not so sophisticated people like Blumenthal, and Palestinians who are being funded and organized in a very effective way, very effective. And they're enlisting young African students on campus, African American kids on campus, other minorities, Hispanic kids on campus. And this movement is adopting to the local situation in different cities across North America. And it's going to be a very serious issue on campus, and it's going to affect Jewish kids, because Jewish kids, whether you're politically active or not, if you go to Hillel, if you want to have kosher food, if you like some cultural events, if you identify as being Jewish, you are going to be the representative of the racist, apartheid, colonial entity, regardless of your politics. You are going to go to an organization that is connected to politically, culturally, economically, with the state with the regime of Israel. And it's going to affect kids on campus, it's affecting faculty on campus. Just one more point, Dan Hayoni, who's a professor of art in New York, is starting a group affiliated with ISGAP of scholars and professors in New York City who are threatened, who have been detrimentally affected by this politics on campus, and who are afraid to speak out, to cope with, to deal with in a public manner of these issues. And there's been over 40 professors in 3 weeks who have signed up for Dan's informal organization of Jewish professors in New York City who are being detrimentally affected, their careers are being detrimentally affected. It's astounding. So if professors are being affected in this way, what's happening to the students on campus? So this, this article, which I know some of you have the books and you can download them for free on our website. We have 80 articles by leading professors from 23 countries. It's all very abstract, and it's all very philosophical and scholarly, and at the same time, it's really becoming an issue in people's day-to-day lives. So those are my informal reflections, and I think we're a small enough, well-informed group where we can have kind of a free discussion, questions, discussion. It can be very informal.